Hi, I'm Mr Craven, Senior Editor of English for NET, and this is a short talk through looking at Macbeth and the symbolism of blood in the play. Okay, let's talk about the kinds of resonances that blood would have had for a Jacobean audience. Now, blood is a common part of Jacobean life. England had been involved in wars across Europe and other parts of the world as well throughout the late 16th and the early 17th centuries. Day-to-day violence involving bloodshed was also commonplace. There are numerous reports of riots, of duels, of arrests for violence in London at the time. Many of Shakespeare's fellow actors and playwrights were actually arrested, were wounded, or even killed in brawls. Executions are public spectacles, and torture, for example, is an accepted part of governing and of policing the population. Now, blood was also part of some of the most popular pastimes, such as bear baiting, bull baiting, cockfighting, and these are all forms of entertainment that were available in Southwark, which was the area where Shakespeare's theatre was situated. And every audience member would have been familiar with, would have seen blood and flesh in terms of butchers and market stalls throughout the city. Now, bloodletting was, by some accounts, the most common medical procedure which was used in the England of the 17th century, and it was used to treat people experiencing a whole range of illnesses and imbalances. Blood, as one of the four humours, was believed to be the source of energy and nutrition for the body and the soul, and that formed a key part of medical beliefs at the time. Noblewomen would deliberately bleed themselves in order to look pale, which was the fashionable appearance of the time. Animal blood was a common ingredient in a range of dishes that were consumed across the country, and both human and animal bloods were believed to have power that made them useful in the dark practices of witchcraft. Now, many of the audience would remember a time when the taking of the bread and wine during the Eucharist in churches, the communion service or ceremony, would have been believed to have involved their literal transformation into the body and blood of Christ that the congregation then consumed in the ceremony. Now, that was declared repugnant and a superstition under Queen Elizabeth in the 1560s, with the wine and bread in the ceremony viewed instead from that point onwards as metaphorical. But for many people, those old beliefs about the transformation still lingered. So for a Jacobean audience, blood is associated then with everything from violence to recreation to medicine to food to religion. It's a literal presence in their everyday lives, but it also carries a wide range of symbolic and of social resonances. Now, in the play, we have, as ever, the first and the most obvious association of blood, which is with violence. And that's visible right from the beginning of the play. Macbeth's sword smoked with bloody execution, we're told. The wounded soldier, or wounded captain, wounded sergeant, he's called various things, is a bloody man, a man covered in blood. Now, even when we don't have the word blood mentioned specifically, it's still there implicitly when Macbeth unseamed MacDonald from the nave to the chaps. It's there when Macbeth and Banquo meant to bathe in reeking wounds, or when the wounded captain's gashes cry for help. Now, this continues throughout the play. The dagger that Macbeth imagines in Act 2, Scene 1 is covered in gouts of blood. There's a wealth of blood references in the murder of Banquo in Act 3. It's there in the deaths of Macduff's family in Act 4. It's even there in the battle that occupies the end of Act 5. So far, so obvious. Now, the second and the more interesting association of blood, cliché though it may be, is as linked to guilt. Now, Lady Macbeth is aware of that very clearly when she asks the spirits in Act 1, Scene 5 to make thick my blood. That's to prevent her from feeling the consequences of the actions that she intends undertaking. In a sense, it's a deliberate imbalancing of the humours. That's, following the Jacobean medical logic. It's particularly noticeable in the implicit juxtaposition of the two fluids that she discusses. There's blood, which is symbolic of violence, of death, and if we leave to one side for the moment the quite complicated view and understanding of menstruation, blood is predominantly associated with masculinity, so that's the first fluid, And the second one is milk, and that's symbolic of fertility, of life, and of femininity. Now, visible blood, the interior becoming exterior, is used to prove the involvement of Duncan's guards in the murder, apparently. Macbeth plans to have those guards marked with blood to show their guilt. Lady Macbeth orders Macbeth to smear the sleepy grooms with blood, and then decides to gild the faces of the grooms with Duncan's blood. And the gild is worth noting, in the sense not just of covering, but of coating in a precious metal, and we'll return to that in a minute. Now, when Duncan's body is discovered, the guards are described as having hands and faces all badged with blood. Badged, the outward and visible sign of guilt. And it's almost ironic in terms of the fundamentally interior nature of blood. Now, it's this sense of blood and guilt, obviously, that leads to Macbeth's question as to whether all great Neptune's ocean can wash this blood clean from my hand. And it's the same sense in which Lady Macbeth notes that my hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white. Her hands, obviously, are red. Blood, violence, guilt. His heart is white, cowardly, dealing with the horror of responsibility and the loss of his purity, feminine, the colour of milk. Blood is also contrasted here with the third key fluid in the play, that's water. Neptune's ocean can't cleanse Macbeth of guilt, he thinks, and that contrasts with Lady Macbeth's claim that a little water clears us of this deed. Now, the image here is deliberately, I think, of baptism. In Christian tradition, baptism is where holy water is symbolically used to cleanse a person of sin. Here, the sin, the killing of God's anointed king, can never be cleansed from Macbeth. And there is that very clear sense of Duncan's blood, more than anybody else's, being viewed as precious and as religiously important. Macduff describes Duncan's body in Act 2, Scene 3 as the Lord's anointed temple, and an audience of the time would be only too aware of the symbolism of blood in a religious sense, the belief in the sacrificial shedding of blood by Christ to redeem people from sin, and also, as mentioned earlier, the use of the blood and body in the Eucharist, the consumption by Christians, symbolically at this point, as we said, of the blood and the body of Christ. Duncan is, similarly, an innocent and a holy figure, a most sainted king, Macduff calls him. And that sacrificial figure is sacrificed by Macbeth for his own selfish ambition. Macbeth also emphasises the value of Duncan's blood. His silver skin, Macbeth says in Act 2, Scene 3, was laced with his golden blood. And that sense of value, of preciousness, of kingliness, links back to the gilding of the guards' faces that Lady Macbeth described earlier. The value of Duncan's interior is mismatched with the exterior of the guards. Duncan's blood, the king's blood, has more value. And that's hence that association with the precious metals. The king is a man, really, but more than that, he's a symbolic figure, he's a spiritual figure. Blood and guilt, this most bloody piece of work, Banquo calls it. A bloody deed, Ross describes it as in Act 2, Scene 4. Macbeth calls Malcolm and Donalbain his bloody cousins in Act 3, Scene 1. The murderer in Act 3 has blood upon thy face as proof of Banquo's death. It's also blood that represents Banquo's ghost's accusation of Macbeth in Act 3, Scene 4. It's seen as shaking its gory locks, and that's its blood-soaked hair. It's a further example of literal blood broadening into a symbolic, almost a social commentary on the impact of violence. Blood hath been shed ere now, Macbeth notes in Act 3, Scene 4, and blood will have blood. The idea is that cyclically, violence begets violence. It's a social issue. And guilt is something that can't be hidden forever. Augurs and understood relations have by maggot pies and choffs and rooks brought forth the secretest man of blood, Macbeth notes ruefully. What's inside the hidden guilt and the hidden blood will be made known, will be exposed, will be brought outside. And this sense of blood as guilt, as responsibility, as a price paid, is clear, I think, in Macbeth's attempt to avoid fighting Macduff. "My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already," he tells Macduff in Act 5, Scene 8. The blood, the cost, is weighing heavily on his conscience. I also think the escalation of the violence is worth noting. Now, in Act 2, Duncan's blood is precious, and the amount on Macbeth's hands is enough to disrupt his equilibrium. By Act 3, Macbeth is in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. He is wading through a river of blood, and trying to return, in terms of the way he phrases it, would simply be as tedious, that's as difficult and dull as carrying on. By the end of the play, Macbeth's become almost bored by violence, uncaring, nonchalant. He notes that whiles I see lives, the gashes do better upon them. Perhaps he has indeed, at this point, become simply a dead butcher, to borrow Malcolm's phrase. Now, blood is also seen as having a supernatural power, and it shouldn't be a surprise that blood is referenced by the witches frequently. They cool their potion with the blood of a baboon, and that's an exotic creature. They pour in sow's blood. Blood for the witches is an ingredient in their spellcasting. It's something vital and natural and precious, but for them, simply an object here to be used. So we've got blood, violence, guilt, religious resonances, witchcraft, but also family. Now, in Act 1, Scene 7, Macbeth describes the first reason that Duncan has to trust him as being because I am his kinsman and his subject. And that familial relationship was clear from Act 1, where Duncan describes Macbeth as his valiant cousin and his worthiest cousin. For a Jacobean audience, cousin simply means relative in a general sense, rather than the specific relationship that we now use it to describe. But it is clear by either method that Macbeth is a blood relative, and that therefore means that the blood Macbeth is spilling when he murders Duncan is the blood of his family. Now, Macbeth's reaction to the blood on his hands in Act 2, Scene 2 is extreme, it is, but it's the range of resonances it has that seem to cause this reaction. It is, after all, the blood of his friend. It's the blood of an innocent. It's the blood of his king. It's an ironic undermining of a religious symbol. It's a symbolic representation also of his shift from warrior to murderer. And it's the blood of his family. It's a really complicated moment for him and a very complicated symbol. Now, Macbeth's awareness of this is clear in Act 2, Scene 3. And that's when he tells Donalbain and Malcolm that the spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped. As the head of the family, Duncan, in this quotation, is the source of Malcolm and Donalbain's blood. And it's an image that neatly conflates both water and blood into an image of natural generation, of creation, of origin. It's no accident, I think, that this links to the juxtaposition of Duncan and Macbeth, again in terms of fertility and sterility. Duncan is a source, he's a creator, a progenitor. Macbeth, as ever, simply destroys, he kills, he spills, he drains, he stops. But it's also a mirror for Lady Macbeth's desire for her blood to be made thick, for the access and passage to remorse to be stopped. Again, we've got sterility, violence, stoppage. And there's every sign that Malcolm knows or suspects exactly what's happened at this point. There's daggers in men's smiles, he tells his brother Donalbain. The near in blood, the nearer bloody. Macbeth, after all, is both those things. Near them, in terms of the family relationship, the blood, but also bloodier than any other character in the play. He is, in this sense, a dead butcher. Right, thank you for listening. Hopefully there have been some useful points, some ideas in there to get you thinking. As ever, do please discuss any questions or queries with your teachers.